welcome everyone to the last SIP seminar of the spring semester. It's my pleasure to have Professor Ying giving us the last seminar. Ying is Associate Professor in the Department of Statistics at Rutgers. She graduated from Georgia Tech University in 2008. She has received 2 major awards in addition to, I presume, a number of other things, but she has the NSF Career Award to her name and also the Institute of Mathematical Sciences Tweedy Award also. And her areas are in experimental design, statistical modeling, and uncertainty quantification. She works a lot with scientists and engineers, and the title of her talk is Statistical Modeling and Uncertainty Quantification for Computer Simulations with Non-Gaussian Processes. So with that, I'll welcome Ying and hand it over to her.
Thank you, Wahi, for inviting me. It's my honor to be here. So I would start with my the outline of my talk. So I'm going to explain what computer simulation or experiment that we usually call means, and then I will motivate you from few examples, and particularly one cell adhesion experiment. I will talk about the detail later on, and I'm going to describe some methods that we use, including modeling and calibration. So we will revisit the example using the method, apply the method that we proposed, and then conclude. So what is computer simulation experiment? Basically, they refer to study of a real system. So I assume that there are some real experiment that you can perform in a lab. But instead of running those experiments, most of the time maybe it's due to its complexity, expensive. Then instead you have some mathematical understanding and you run the experiment in the lab using simulations, using mathematical models. It can be ODE or PDE. And they are widely used as alternative to those physical experiments that you conduct in a lab that I mentioned. Due to some reasons, maybe, as I mentioned, expensive, dangerous, or just inconvenient. And so I would like to mention that I focus it has been a lot of work focusing on deterministic simulation, which means same input to the, if you give same input to the simulation to the computer, it will produce exactly the same output no matter when you run it. It might depend on, it might associate with some numerical errors. I would assume that some part of that is taken care by mathematicians. But I would say the method I describe here actually can, or actually I focus on stochastic simulations. But many of the methods described in computer experiment literature, they can be extended to deterministic ones as well. So there are some objectives that in general for computer experiment, people like to do some prediction. So for example, I have these simulations that I can conduct. It might still take time, but so I cannot try all the different combinations, but I want to predict, maybe optimize it or do some prediction for some untried settings. So that's one of my goals. Another goal is that for many of the simulations, some input actually I only know a range of, like for example, this input actually is valid from 0.1 to 0.5. But any value can be possible. But I think from the domain knowledge, I believe there should be a value that maybe I can represent the real physical data in a better way. So one goal is to tune, we would say, calibration of those parameters in your simulation. So I have a bunch of examples, fluid dynamic simulations, and then I'm going to focus, give you one example on material science. So this molecular dynamic simulator has about 300 inputs. So just to show you the complexity of this model, this simulation. So when we talk about, you probably when you hear this title, uncertainty quantification, people actually from different areas, they mean different things. For mathematicians, they might have a simple or relatively simple differential equation, and then they would start from there to try to work on finite element approach or find the solution and maybe find out the uncertainty associated with the solution. So they view this as more like an inverse problem. But for a statistician, maybe we're talking about a more, so I'm going to tell you what my view of uncertainty quantification. And so I'm going to use a material science example to illustrate that in a couple of slides later. So this is roughly the things that we do in computer experiments. So there are several tasks. Before you get anything, before you produce any results, we have experimental design stage, like how to explore the experimental region more carefully if you cannot run all of them. So this is a classical area in statistics. However, for simulation, the problem are more complex. So we cannot just do this traditional fractional factorial design with like 2 levels for each variable. So we need some space filling design. We have some ideas about that. And also we have low accuracy simulation, high accuracy simulation, and then on top of it, experimental data. So how to conduct the experiment so that I can combine the data in a more effective way, or how to do this type of experimental setting sequentially, adaptively. We have some work along that line. And once we have this design, we can run the simulation. So assuming that the simulation, although it's cheaper, faster than real physical experiments, still you cannot try all of them. So it's impossible to run all the combinations. So given that I try only those that I have designed, and in terms of later on prediction or combining the data from simulation and physical data, I'm not going to use the simulation data itself. I'm going to build a statistical surrogate model we call emulator. So basically, given a small set or a set of realization from simulation, I hope since I cannot try all the combinations, then I'm going to build a model that to approximate these simulations. So that's called my emulation. And using this emulator and the physical data, as I mentioned, some of the parameters in this simulation actually have only a range that I understand it should be correct, but which value I am not sure yet. And clearly I can see there's a discrepancy between the real observation and the simulated data. So I hope that I can model or quantify this discrepancy and try to find the setting of those parameters in the simulation so that the discrepancy is minimized. So this is called calibration. So there are a few things that we can do for analyzing computer experiments. So by combining these 2 models, I will have a statistical model, and using that, I can do prediction optimization. So that's the goal of roughly the task. And as I mentioned, I'm going to use a material science example to illustrate the complexity of this problem. So there are equations involved in this simulation, and the goal there is to predict material properties. So based on what I learned, they wanted to know what kind of force field parameter setting that I can produce a material property that close to the truth that I observed. And so there are different types of material properties they are interested in, and they are around 300 input parameters, force field parameters in the simulation. So for most of the mathematical problem, when they talk about uncertainty quantification, they probably involve 1 variable, 2 variables, then you can write down the differential equation. So this is the one part of the equation that my collaborator from Penn State Material Science Center, they provided me. So I started looking at the equations. I hope I can understand all the details. And then they told me, no, don't work on it yet, because this is only the 20% of the equations that they have. So there are 5 more pages. So it's kind of different from the mathematical uncertainty quantification that I can write down nicely the differential equation and start from there. So to me, treat this input, output, and this whole simulation like a black box. So I want to build a statistical model so that I can understand what happened in this black box. So in this example, there are about 300 inputs for those different force field parameter settings. And the output is 600, so describing different material properties that they're interested in. And this type of simulation is deterministic. It can be time-consuming for running all the combinations in this 300-dimensional space. So this is one example of simulation that we are interested in. So I'm assuming that most of the simulations that we have cannot be easily described using just one or two simple differential equations. So this is another example that I have been working on for quite a while. So this is called cell adhesion. So they are trying to understand how now it's getting more people interested in this. That is, they want to know how cells communicate with each other through their proteins. So on the surface of cells, they have these proteins. So it's like keys on this side of the cell and locks on the other side. So you want to know which key corresponding to this lock. So they may be not necessarily one-to-one correspondence, but the scientists, biologists wanted to know which protein can recognize this receptor. So it's important related to the immune system. So biologists like to describe this type of binding. So if the key recognize a lock, then they would like shaking hands, they recognize each other. So this is a binding. So they wanted to solve some questions related to like how and when and what cells they bind to each other. So this is the experimental setting that you see the four pictures, four panels here. So there's a red blood cell. It has molecules on the surface, and the other side is another cell that has protein on top of it. So you can imagine that one side is some keys maybe, the other side are some locks. So you want to know if they can recognize each other. So you push, so from picture A, you push this red blood cell towards the other cell surface and create a contact. And then you can leave them for a while to create a contact, stable contact. So we call this contact time. It might stay for 0.5 seconds. And then retrace away. So there will be two outcomes, two possibilities, either C or D. So figure C indicates that the two cells separate immediately. So that means the proteins on top of it, there's no key or lock type of relation. The key doesn't recognize the lock, or the lock doesn't recognize the key. So the two proteins do not shake hands. But on this, in this figure D, when the retraction happens, the red blood cells stretched. So the shape it looks quite a little bit different from the beginning. So this is called adhesion. So basically, the molecule, the receptor recognize the ligand, so they shake hands. They don't want to be splitted right away. So these two outcomes will indicate 0 or 1. So this has been analyzed by my collaborator in biomechanical engineering department at Dataset for many years. And they were running real experiments in the lab. So I've been analyzing this for some time. And after that, this is interesting because I've been working with them for like 5 years. And then in some conversation, I started to explain that I have another interest that working on simulated data. And then one of the postdocs said, actually, before we run most of the experiment, we try some simulation because we want to know what should be the next stage, or we wanted to know a little bit more about the fundamental biology, because using a simplified mathematical model or a sequence of models, although you understand those models are based on assumptions, but using mathematical models, you can understand some structure or describe some structures. So they still perform some experiments, simulations. So interestingly, they also do simulations. Besides the real experimental data, they have simulations. And so the formal definition here is just a formal definition that describes what computer simulation or computer experiments are. So if the components of the process of interest and their interactions are adequately understood, so it can be simulated. So you probably have some understanding. And the physics of the process is sufficiently well understood, so it can be described by a mathematical model relating the response to the potential vectors that affect the output. So we use that as a proxy for the real physical process. And I described some features. I want to emphasize that the design issue is quite different here, and it's important. At the same time, the complexity of those problems are much higher. The dimension, the number of inputs into the models are much higher than usual classical experimental design idea that we had before. So also those simulations are, although efficient alternatives, they can also be time consuming. So I emphasize that you cannot try, it's impossible to try all the combinations that you are interested in. For example, if you have a differential equation, a bunch of differential equations, if you are actually able to try all the combinations, then you actually realize the whole system. So you don't need statistician. There's no stochastic involved. So it's all done. You know the underlying structure completely. However, in most of the cases, like the one that I mentioned, 300-dimensional space, it's impossible to try all of them. So that's the complexity of any questions so far before we move on to the model?
So I have a quick question. So is the only purpose of these simulations to inform something about how to do physical experiments or physical discovery, or is that fundamentally also informing scientific discovery questions?
Both, yes. So because for physical experiments, you cannot try some of the combination, right? So you want to understand, for this combination, I can try, maybe I can try simulation. I know that there's a discrepancy between simulation and the physical data. So I want to take into account both the information I have and then predict any untry setting. And maybe serve the ultimate goal probably is optimization or prediction. But to answer your question, it's both.
Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, so let's move on to the modeling part. So in general, we use Gaussian process model to analyze this type of data. So let me first use a picture to illustrate what Gaussian process means. So this is a very simple one-dimensional example of Gaussian process model. It's a very flexible model. So assuming the underlying mathematical equation actually produce the result, which is the blue dashed line. So that's the underlying truth. And if you can run all of them, then that's the end of the story. You understand the whole structure already. So you don't need statistician because everything is known. However, in most of the case, in this example, although it's simple, so I only just show you that pretend we cannot try all of them. So we only run 8 settings. That's the circles that we have, those 8 points. And using that 8 points, I hope that I can build a statistical model. It's called simulator to capture the underlying structure. So the red line is a prediction using Gaussian process model. So you can see it goes through all the observations, the 8 points. The reason is, as I mentioned, if it's deterministic, those are truths. When I do prediction for the point that I already observed, I would expect exactly the same output that I observed. There's no error. It's not from physical data that, oh, you have measurement error. There's no error at all. So the model actually reflects the truth that they are deterministic. Okay, so I can use this model to do prediction. For example, here, I want to predict what's going to happen if x equal to minus 0.2, something like this. It will be around here. I can predict here. This is my point prediction. And the nice thing about Gaussian process is that since I have this distributional assumption, I can also give you the uncertainty associated with this prediction. So that's the gray area. And you can see if I'm going to predict somewhere that is far away from my observation, the uncertainty would increase. The region of the gray areas would increase. So that's another nice thing about this Gaussian process model. So how this model is written, let's go back to the modeling form. So Y is the response. And let's say we have several X input. It can be p-dimensional space. And the first part is like simple regression that we learn in any statistical 101 class, that Y equal to X beta. And the key is the second part. This Zx, we assume it's a Gaussian process. So for now here, we assume it's a stationary process, but if it's non-stationary, we have tools to deal with it. But to start with something more standard, we assume this Z is a stationary Gaussian process with mean zero and some covariance function described in this way. So this covariance function is an n by n matrix. And so this n is the sample size. So how many data that you have, this will be the n. And this theta is the correlation parameter unknown. So there are some unknown. Beta, the correlation beta is unknown. And there are some correlation parameter associated with your correlation function is unknown. So typically, we explain those theta very similar to the role of theta, but in a way that we explain this theta as explaining the smoothness of coming from this particular dimension. So for example, if we have p-dimensional space, p-dimensional input, each input would have one corresponding correlation parameter explaining how smooth this y in that particular direction. So for each dimension, we will have a beta and a correlation parameter associated with that. They are unknown. So we can write down the likelihood and do the maximum likelihood estimation to estimate all the parameters. And I want to mention that one thing make this Gaussian process model difficult to implement for large sample, large N, is due to those R inverse. You can see all the MLE can be written in a closed form, except this correlation parameter, but still in a nice form. But the key is that this R is a n by n correlation matrix with unknown parameters, and n is the sample size. So imagine if it's 10,000, then you have to calculate inverse for this 10,000 by 10,000 matrix. So computationally, it's difficult. So we have some tool. I have developed some tools some idea that can, similar to split and conquer, or bootstrap subsampling, or maybe called sub-bagging idea to reduce the complexity of those models. So here, just the standard way of doing estimation, and these are predictions. So based on, so this is if you give me a new setting x0, I'm going to do the prediction, and this p0 will be the predictive mean. And the distribution is still Gaussian, it's still normal, and the variance is going to be this m0. So you have that's how you get this nice distributional structure for prediction. So this is one example using exactly what we just described, the formula here. So that's the prediction, point prediction, and the predictive distribution. Okay, so we can handle high-dimensional case theoretically without problem. Computationally, it can be intensive, but we do have some tools to do sub-bagging, so it should be solvable. So let's go back to the simulation in biology that we have. There are some simulators that I would not describe how this looks. These are the kinetics that related to cell biology, and this is the data. So in this example, there are 6-dimensional inputs. So compared to the material science problem, this is much easier. So the material problem, we're still working on it because not only the input dimension is large, the output is even larger. It's 600 dimension. So we're still struggling with that. But this one is relatively much easier to handle. And notice that the response is 0 or 1. So that's a unique feature that you probably noticed. When I talk about Gaussian process model, that our y has to be assumed to be normal, Gaussian distributed. However, in my data, the y's are either 0 or 1. They are binding or no binding. This actually happened also in my material science application. Sorry, any question? If not, okay. So if you have any questions, stop me anytime, okay? So this also happened in my material science application that actually for some combination of the force field parameters, they will lead to infeasible results. So before we do any optimization, the first question I want to know is what kind of input combination could produce a result? Many of them would produce infeasible results, but there's no closed form mathematical expression that I can understand this boundary condition or infeasible condition. So I have to build a model to predict if this combination will lead to feasible or infeasible results. So in that case, it's also 0, 1. So that's our challenge in applying Gaussian process model directly here, because it's simply not continuous. So we saw some literature in either spatial statistics or machine learning. There are some tools to model those non-Gaussian data, but here we are also interested in quantifying the prediction uncertainty. So we need to have a systematic inference procedure. So we didn't see any systematic approach with rigorous analysis given. So we want to explore along this direction. And so that's why so this is another example that either feasible or infeasible in the force field parameter setting. It's also come with this binary data. So another example, you probably see this slide recently that is given by Bill Gates, that he actually gave this a TED talk that maybe 2015, but he kept emphasizing this. So this is a slide he talked about in 2018 in a conference, New England Journal of Medicine, a conference. So this is the simulation, pandemic simulation, and the simulated results, although it's spatial, temporal, distributed, but the outputs are the number of deaths. So it can be also not maybe you probably would interested in simulating the infected numbers. All those are count data, so they are not necessarily Gaussian distributed. So you have many other examples that you have this non-Gaussian type of data. So for this particular example, this is called agent-based simulation. They are stochastic. So this is just another feature of this type of data, that it can be stochastic, but our approach can extend to that as well. So Another challenge, but it probably only appear in this data, is that I haven't seen other application that mix these two type of challenge together. But I would expect that this appear maybe also in those pandemic simulations, because you can simulate stochastic behavior over time. So we found that the data actually has time series structure, and particularly for the cell adhesion experiment, that single molecule experiment that we recognize, we noticed that when we collect the data, so this is under this setting of the variables, for a same pair, assume that for same pair of cell, we repeatedly do this experiment, and we run those simulations as well as real data. We found that if I fix the setting and perform the experiment repeatedly to the same pairs of cells, and the chance of getting adhesion is not independent. So the plot that I draw is just to show the biologists that if I condition on the previous behavior, the conditional probability of 1 to 0 or 1 to 1 actually is not the same. So that means I don't expect that you read the detail of the plot, but the take-home message is that given on the previous result, if there's an adhesion, actually the cell can remember what happened in the previous test, and the chance of having the next adhesion is higher. So there's a time series structure there, and biologists give you the catch name. They say this is a memory in single molecule. So we wanted to incorporate that into our statistical model. So the model actually is very intuitive. So basically what we do is we still have a linear type of model, X beta here, and we also have a Gaussian process model, but we like to extend the simple Gaussian process model, standard Gaussian process model, to non-Gaussian data by taking some transformation. So for binary data, we just look at the logistic transformation, similar to the generalized linear model corresponding to linear model. So we want to build a class of model that corresponding to Gaussian process model when it comes to non-Gaussian data. So this actually can be used for any exponential type of data that using different transformation. If it's count data, you can try some transformations. So according to different type, you can implement this according to different transformation. And to address the time series structure, we incorporate in a linear model term, we involve the previous result to incorporate the memory effect, saying that the prediction, the adhesion probability, so this P indicates that given the setting, what is the probability that the cell is going to recognize each other and lead to this shape change. So the probability depends on the setting, but at the same time, it also depends on the previous performance that hopefully can incorporate the memory effect. And so the estimation procedure is straightforward. We derive all this in the paper. And we can also do some, so these are just theoretical support that all the estimators are asymptotically normal distributed, has a nice standard, asymptotic structure properties. But the thing that we are particularly interested in is the prediction. So plugging the estimator, as I mentioned, for Gaussian process model, we have this nice interpolation property that the prediction, if you predict the setting that I have already observed, the result would exactly the same as the one that you observed. The y is exactly the same. So that's called interpolation. So we want to know if we build something for generalizing this Gaussian process model, is there any interpolation property that we have here? And the answer is yes. The short answer is yes. The long answer is no. So this is the assumption. So given this is a binary output, similar to generalized linear model, if given the data, if I also understand the underlying probability, so every time I observe x and y, but I also know the underlying probability. So if the probability are known to me, then the model, the prediction that I conducted, is going to interpolate those probabilities. So we do have interpolation property. However, in practice, you only observe x and y. You don't know what the p's are, the potential underlying probability. So without that, we do not have interpolation property. So the take-home message is that it's intuitive, right? If all the x and y are known and the underlying probabilities are known to me, then I know everything. So my model should be able to interpolate the probability, underlying probability. So without knowing that in the data, then so this result is saying that yes, I can interpolate the data, the probability if the underlying p's are given or not. But in practice, it's not the case. So we only know x and y. So we do not have the nice interpolation property. Instead, there will be a variation associated with that. So this is the variation. Basically, interpolation means that if my future prediction happen to be the one that I observed, then the corresponding variation will be zero, no variation at all. But for our case, if you don't know underlying p, there will be a variation associated with that unknown part. So that makes sense. So the prediction that we propose makes sense without any information from the underlying probability. The predictor cannot interpolate the training set. However, if you know the underlying probability, it's a perfect interpolator. And the variance is due to the uncertainty of the underlying probability. So that makes perfect sense. So this is one plot of the predictor that we have. So the red dots are the data that we observe. So you can see the plot doesn't look like the one that we just showed that interpolate for those observations. See the variation gets zero and then increase and gets zero for those that I observed. So you can see I draw the underlying truth. That is the black dots. And the prediction is the blue line. And the gray areas is the uncertainty associated with that. So that's the generalized, we call this generalized Gaussian process model. So we do try some simulations to compare the proposed method with several candidates that maybe we can modify, although it's not designed directly for our use, but we still modify it. And we show that actually the method that we propose has smaller variation than compared to those data. And we analyze the data and find some other Gaussian process model fitted. And I want to show you that there's a continuation of that. That is the calibration part. So once you have a model for simulation, that's just first step because that's called emulation. So instead of working on the simulation now, I summarize or approximate the data that I have by this emulator. Now the next step is called calibration. So I want to show you the calibration by this plot. So basically, this column is representing the real experiment that we conduct in the lab. This blue column is the computer simulation. So usually there are two types of variables involved. So first two, you can see they are shared for both columns. Those you can control in the real lab. You can also control in the simulation. But there's another set of variables. We call them calibration parameters. They only appear in simulation. So these four, you can, so they are different, represent different biological meanings, but you cannot measure them. You cannot control them in a lab. So the biologists wanted to know, okay, so I understand this range of this kinetic parameter has to be from 0 to 0.5. But exactly what value should be set up, I don't know. So the goal is that if I compare these two data sets, I want to know, can I fix the setting so that my simulation can mimic what happened in the lab in a way that the discrepancy between these two can be minimized. So that's my goal. So this is the goal of calibration. So in statistics, it was discussed around 2000. So people proposed a Bayesian framework. Basically, this part is called simulation model. So this is the emulator that we just built based on Gaussian process. And these are the physical data from the lab, and you model them. So basically, this is a Bayesian approach that connects the physical data in the lab and the simulation through this part. It's called discrepancy. So there are two goals here. First, I want to know what is the discrepancy. I want to model this. Secondly, I want to minimize the difference by finding the setting of theta. Okay, because theta only appeared in my simulation. So I understand within that range that given from the based on domain knowledge, that the whole range is possible, feasible, reasonable. But I want to find a setting that minimizes the discrepancy of the two. So Bayesian approach is to connect these two by this type of equation. So this is discrepancy. However, there's an important issue called identifiability issue. That is, given the simulation and physical data, the theta and delta x, that means the parameter that you are interested in, and the discrepancy are not identifiable. There's no unique solution to that. So if I want to understand the biological insight or material science insight, then I need to know specifically, I need this parameter to be identifiable. If I want to refine my mathematical equation, differential equation, I need this to be identifiable so that it provides sufficient information. So this is one criticism in this Bayesian approach. So people proposed actually by Tuo and Wu in the annual paper 2015, they simply proposed that let's first focus on identifying the theta, okay? And the goal is to minimize the L2 distance between the simulation and physical data. And by minimizing that, I can find the setting of theta. And they show that this process actually can produce the theta hat that converge, if there's a true theta, it converges to this theta star. So we take this L2 minimization idea, we call this L2 projection, L2 calibration. So we use this idea to this binary data. So for physical data, we can, the output is also binary, so we can build a kernel method, build a model using kernel method, and the generalized Gaussian process model for the simulation. And we try to find the setting theta. Here's the goal. We try to find the setting of theta, which is the calibration parameter, the four of them that I listed, by minimizing the discrepancy between simulation and the lab data. So we can show that they are consistent, asymptotically normal, and also achieve a nice semi-parametric efficiency. So this is we implement the method that just proposed to this data set. So basically, these are the 4 parameters we call calibration parameter. We want to find out what should be the setting so that the 2 results can be minimized. So for physical data, we use a kernel logistic regression to fit a model. And for binary simulations, we use this generalized Gaussian process model, just described. So by minimizing the difference, we found the setting of the 4 calibration parameters, which to be listed here. So this is the setting that minimizes the discrepancy. So we plug in this setting to the simulation just to take a look at the discrepancy, see if it really reflects the truth or captures what happened in a lab. So indeed, you can see the black and the blue ones matches in a nice way when I project to the 2 input variables. So you can see it has this nice increasing trend match each other, and these variables maybe not as important, not as significant as the first one, but still it has a nice match in terms of prediction. So so that's the final model that we have. So at the end, we are going to use this model with the theta setting that we found here. So that will be our statistical model for future prediction, because we have already verified that this simulation can mimic the lab data. So we're going to use this model to do prediction. So go back to Wahid's question. This model can be used for any prediction, future prediction. It can also provide you some scientific insight if you care about the kinetic coefficients. So the meaning of them, I can explain, okay, maybe in this data that I will observe, this actually have the half-lifetime equal to something which compared to some other cell may be having another value. So it did provide some scientific insight. Okay, so that's the conclusion of my talk. So we propose a framework that has a generalized Gaussian process model and a calibration procedure. So all these are parallel to what we already have for Gaussian type of data. So it has this nice correspondence with interpolation property appear also here for generalized version. So that's all of my talk. Any questions so far?